Now, the African Export-Import Bank, Afrexim, has set aside about $200 million to support airlines in the continent. The support will be in form of lines of credit and a leasing platform, which is under development. CNBC Africa's Charles Gitonga spoke to Rene Awambeng, Global Head of Client Relations at Afrexim Bank, and started by asking him to define the aviation-related infrastructure gap on the continent.
You know, the African Export-Import Bank was set up by visionary African leaders to be Africa's trade finance bank. This is to support trade and trade-related infrastructure on the continent. Now, as you rightly say, there is a deficit today of trade of infrastructure on the continent for about $100 billion. Now, we have as a strategic objective the promotion of intra-African trade and the facilitation of intra-African trade and the growth also of extra-African trade. You cannot promote or facilitate trade, either intra-African or extra-African, without the development of infrastructure. This is why we have a commitment to support the development of airports, airlines, seaports, intra-regional roads and railways on the continent. So the African Export-Import Bank over the years has developed significant experience and expertise in the aircraft financing industry. We have supported some governments and countries to structure their national carriers. We have supported in the financing, either through asset financing or operational leases or financial leases, to finance fleet for some of the airline companies on the continent. We've supported Kenya Airways, we've supported the Angolans, we've supported the Senegalese, we've supported the Ivorians. And so we have built a reputation as the leading financial institution on the continent to support the aviation industry. We have gone into partnership with the Russian Export Center, which last year became a shareholder of the African Export-Import Bank, to promote Russian aviation, so the Sukhoi jets or the MC-21 aircrafts on the African continent as part of this program to support the infrastructure related to trade. And we have put in place some financing structures. We are working on a leasing platform, and we've put in place some asset-based financing structures with our Russian counterparties and Russian banks to support national carriers or private carriers that would like to acquire these aircrafts.
And what's your reading of the demand in that space, in the aviation space, in terms of the aircrafts, now that you're working with the Russian Export Center? And what would be your expectations for this partnership?
So you see, our demographics are growing in Africa every day. The GDP is growing at averagely 4.6% on the continent, right? There are retirements in terms of aircraft that are leaving the market, and there are new orders that are coming in. And we see a lot of initiatives either from national airlines or governments that want to promote their own independent aircraft. So there is a strong demand for domestic air travel, for regional air travel, and also for international air travel. So we believe that there will be about 180 orders a year on the continent going forward for new aircraft.
Mm-hmm. And so we are talking about intra-Africa trade at about 15%. Global figures, our claim of the global figure is even lower at about 3%. But at the same time, we talk about the rigidity in rules, flying rules in the operating an airline in Africa. Why are all these conversations not talking to each other? Yet we know the gap that's there, and we've been talking about what we should do.
You would see that in the last couple of months, there has been some significant evolution on the African continent in forging new partnerships in trade. So there is an agreement now about open skies that was signed about 2 months ago. And recently in Kigali, late last month, there was the signing of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, these are major landmark events in the history of our continent, which will now open up the continent for free movement of people, free movement of goods and services. We, as an African financial institution, will now have to play the role of facilitating either the infrastructure or the acquisition of the infrastructure to enable goods and to enable the percentage of people and goods moving. You can recall very well, in Kigali, we made a commitment to support intra-African trade for up to $25 billion in the next 5 years. So within the framework of this, aircraft financing and aviation financing is one of the key sectors that the bank is going to look to develop.
And so you mentioned some agreements here that are landmark agreements for the trade within Africa. But signing is one thing. It's a good sign of goodwill. But we need now to move to the ratification stage, which takes quite a bit of work and quite a bit of time. Is that a concern for you as a major player who's looking to see these agreements work so that all the investments that you're making are effective?
We are optimistic that the leadership of the continent will take the responsibility and ratify these agreements. It might take some time, but we are optimistic that the leadership will ratify these agreements that we're signing in Kigali. Yeah.
All right, so let's look at what the biggest challenge then is for trading in Africa today. We've talked about your role supporting the aviation industry, supporting the airlines as well, but what now is a big challenge? We have some big agreements that we've just mentioned.
The biggest challenge remains the financing gap, and this is what we are trying to fill. The biggest challenge remains access to finance this infrastructure. So we need to have credible projects either driven by governments or private sector or public-private sector partnerships to be able to move or close this gap in the infrastructure space. And by forging strategic alliances and partnerships like what we have done with the Russians, will go a long way to elevate this financing gap on the continent.
And for the airliners in this business, how do they exactly plug in the Afrexim framework? You've talked about financing, you've talked about working on a leasing platform. How exactly do they plug in?
The airline financing business is quite a complex business. Fortunately, we haven't developed on the African continent the leasing business. The aircraft leasing business is well developed in North America and in Europe. What we are trying to do is to move away from direct asset financing into setting up lease platforms so that national carriers and private sector companies operating in the airline industry can be able to lease these aircrafts on commercial terms which are not heavy on their balance sheets.
All right, so finally, what then would be the targets of Afrexim Bank other than just financing the aviation industry, other than just working on the infrastructure bit? You have a long-term vision for trade financing the continent, but what are the short-term goals that we should look at the next 5 years?
So as part of our 5-year strategic plan, which is the Impact 2021, the African Export-Import Bank has set itself 3 key strategic pillars. One of them, the key one, is to promote intra-African trade. And we have set ourselves very key objectives how we want to promote intra-African trade in terms of facilitation, in terms of lending, and to grow the percentage of intra-African trade on the continent. We have actually set up a new business unit within the bank to drive this initiative. Trade finance leadership, again, is one of our key objectives, which is to promote trade. So what we are doing with the Russians is extra African trade to promote trade. And the last pillar is industrialization and export development. So we are transforming Africa's natural resources for export development. And you see how the aviation fits in. If you need to move the goods and services into the market, you need to move them probably through an aviation. So you take horticulture. If you have a Kenyan farmer who is now growing flowers or growing fresh vegetables, how do you take this product to the market on a timely basis? You need to have airports that work. You need to have systems. You need to have cargo aircrafts that work. And this is where we as a bank come in to facilitate that kind of trade.